Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eli, and I'm here to talk to you about running public betas, doing user testing in production. Show of hands, who here is involved with running public betas as part of their work or has done that kind of thing before? Okay, a handful. It's a really fun thing to do if you work if you work in a product company to sort of get some hands-on, some very direct feedback from the people who use your product. It's always interesting to hear what your users have to say. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today is if you are running a public beta, what is that? How do you do it well? My background here is, I'm going to turn on my clicker first. Introductions and disclaimers. So this is me. I am a person who loves the internet, loves technology. I sort of learn about all sort of weird things and come and talk about them at conferences. But the background I have that's relevant here is that for the last 3 years, I've worked as a developer advocate, which means that often what that means is I'm the bridge between the technical users of a product for a company and the people who build that product. So I've been very involved in talking to users of the product, getting their technical feedback, and using that to turn that into actionable, sort of useful stuff that the development team can then work on in order to improve the product. This is an opinionated talk. This is my take on public betas and what I think works well. Your mileage may vary, but I'm hoping to provide a fairly balanced view that's informed by my own experience on the topic. This advice isn't limited to developer tooling. All the companies I've done this for have been for developer tooling, so web frameworks and platforms, cloud service providers, things of this nature. But this advice holds true even if your users aren't technical. So the general broad themes that I'm talking about are going to be irrelevant to you if you're somebody who talks to users, even if those users aren't also developers. Obviously, when you talk to your users who are developers, it's a little bit different because you know us, we're like picky and we're opinionated about the things that we use, and we're going to have very particular opinions about those, which is one of the reasons that developer companies like to do betas, because it's particularly valuable when your users are developers, but it's not limited to that. I also am going to be using one of my former employers, Anvil, as a case study in this talk, just some screenshots of some various things that they've got going at the moment. Very kindly of them, they decided to release a new public beta just a couple of weeks ago. For this, I don't work there anymore. I haven't worked there for a year. But so there's some very fresh content from them who so kindly provided that to me for this talk. So we're going to talk about what a public beta is and when it's useful to use one. We're going to talk about how you can document what's going on in your public beta, because as we all know, documentation is part of a product. If you don't tell people how to use your thing, you can't expect them to do so. And when you're running a public beta, you're often trying to document two versions of reality, and that can get really tricky. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about collecting and using feedback from your users, which is the entire point of running a beta, is to get opinions of people who are using the thing. And I'm going to talk about pitfalls to avoid, ways that this process can go wrong, how to diagnose and treat those kind of problems. And I'm going to talk about, if you are running a public beta, how to wrap it up and make that new feature part of your sort of generally available product, how to end a public beta period. So, what is a public beta? We have these ideas in software development of sort of alpha and beta and then sort of, going to general availability, and the alpha is like the really rough and ready version, like not even quite an MVP. The edges are very rough. You maybe have to use the command line to do things that you would actually rather be doing in some kind of GUI. It's the very early development stages of the thing where it's starting to take shape. A beta is something where it really is an MVP at this point. It can solve the problems that it's set out to solve, whatever the thing that you're building is. And then sometimes you will want lots and lots of people to use that thing in order to improve it to the point where it's ready to become officially released. And that's what a public beta is. It's letting people use a thing that you're building while you're building it for the purposes of getting user feedback, like early user feedback while you're still developing the product. So we have this idea of quality in software, and we like to think that the quality sort of goes up over time, and over time it will sort of tend towards, but maybe not actually reach perfection. And the more time you spend in things, the lower return you get on that time. That line is going up ever more slowly as you get towards perfection. And a lot of your product will be somewhere on this line, right? This is obviously sort of an abstraction, but like if you've got a product that already exists, it's going to be on this line. When you're building a new product, maybe to replace some existing functionality or maybe an entirely new product, it's going to move through that line over time. And the sort of minimum viable product is, when you do release something new, you want it to be further along than your existing product. You want it to be better. That's the point. You're trying to improve things as you go along. Maybe you're improving your existing product by adding functionality. Maybe you're replacing some bit of it that was broken or outdated, and it's going to be better than it was before. But in order to get there, it has to pass through this stage, being a minimum viable product. So this is the kind of idea that I'm going to use as we go through this talk, where you've got what you've already built, and this is pretty good. You want it to be better, and while you're building it, it's not going to be quite as good yet. So one idea of using public betas is whenever you are at, proxies for quality. Sorry, I moved around my slides just before this, and it was a mistake. This line, this thing is very abstract, right? And you can't actually touch the quality of your project. You can't measure it with an exact number, so we use proxies for this quality. And these proxies are things like the frequency of outages of a given product that you have, or frequency of bugs, so GitHub issue backlog. The more outages you have, the more bugs that you have, the worse your quality. But you also have things like user opinions. And at certain stages of the product development lifecycle, you don't have access to things like user opinions or necessarily frequency of outages if it's not deployed and being used. So there are some proxies for quality we can only get when the thing is already in production and in use by real people. And this is what a public beta gets us. So when we're talking about user opinions and deploying things to our users, we have certain responsibilities if we want our users to become part of the development process. If they're going to take part in a public beta and use something that's not really that good yet, they need to get something out of it. So if you're going to run a public beta, here are some things that I think need to be satisfied in order for you to actually expect users to invest time and effort and frustration into helping you. Public beta has got to be opt-in. You can't force sort of unfinished, buggy products on people. People have to go, yes, I am partaking in this of my own free will. And once you have that buy-in from them, that they will actually be a lot more engaged in the process of giving you feedback. So your beta has to be opt-in. It has to be reversible. You can't make a public beta that someone can then not back out of. So the reason I say this is because one of the things that Anvil did was what their product is a web framework and hosting service for building Python web apps. And they have an online IDE. And one of their longest running betas was they overhauled the entire online IDE. And they wanted people to be able to use this new thing, help them refine it, help them debug it, help them identify issues so that they could debug it. But if that new IDE was really, really buggy and people couldn't actually use it, but they'd locked themselves into using it and couldn't go back to the old one, that would have been a real problem. So if you're going to introduce something that's maybe a replacement for a new product or a replacement for an existing product, you need to let people reverse their work, reverse that change, and go back to previous workflows so that they don't lose functionality by partaking in your public beta. It also needs to be worthwhile for them. If what you're offering to your users is, okay, help us use a worse version of this thing for a while, and they don't actually get any benefit out of doing that, other than a sense of contributing to your product development, which if you've got a lot of goodwill from your users, that is a very valuable thing that they'll like to be part of the process. But in general, if you're going to run a public beta, you should be offering something to your users through that beta. Access to new functions, better user experience, even while it's in beta, things like this. It has to make sense for your users to want to participate. When should you use one? Well, in any situation where you've got new experimental features, so you don't quite know how things are going to work out. For example, maybe you've got potential for people to lose their data. You need to make that opt-in. Obviously, you need to put massive disclaimers over the top of it. You can't just release a new experimental feature into GA and not let people know that there are these kind of risks. And if you've got sort of a high chance of things not working out or things working out in ways that you hadn't foreseen, If you're introducing a new feature and you go, okay, this might interact with other parts of my software in ways that I hadn't quite foreseen. Maybe we've introduced something that uses a new data type and it shows up in other places and it's going to be handled by the system poorly or something like this. This covers a whole range of really weird edge cases. When you foresee weird edge cases, essentially, and you can't identify them by thinking ahead, or there are so many that you can't identify them by thinking ahead, you just need to put it out there and get people to generate those use cases for you. You might also want to do it if you're doing significant changes to your core functionality, like replacing an entire online IDE. So if you've got a new underlying framework or a new IDE, and if you're going to be disrupting user journeys throughout your software with whatever it is that you're introducing. Let's say you've got a new way of doing invoices and suddenly a whole load of people's workflows are going to be broken. That's a really good chance to do a public beta and see what people think about this and if they like that new user journey better with time to acclimate to it. If you've got varied use cases of your software, so a web framework, a web development platform where people are using it to build apps that were doing things like interacting with cryptocurrencies, like dip checkers, I think they're called. People who are using them to build like anything you can imagine building web apps for. That's a perfect use case for doing like a public beta. This ties into the unforeseeable interactions. If you've got a lot of varied use cases, that's a lot more kind of surface where things like that could crop up. So if you're introducing an entirely new platform, so at Scaleway, my last employer, web service provider, a cloud service provider, we introduced a new observability platform. People are going to be using that for all kinds of things, plugging into all kinds of infrastructure they were hosting with us. And we wanted a chance to see all of those different user use cases before we said this thing is actually ready to go. And it, we wanted to sort of gate that access to only people who had opted in to the public beta. And if you've got, new ways to interoperate with third-party tools, so let's say I'm introducing a way to add plugins to my new developer thing. You can't possibly account for all the different kinds of plugins that people might write, so you might want to open that up as a beta before you say, okay, we can make this generally available, and we're pretty confident this isn't going to break everything in the whole world. If you're not ready to deprecate existing versions, this is really common with HTTP APIs. If your users have high inertia, and this is, if anyone's seen this XKCD thing, has anyone seen this comic before? So the comic is a chat where somebody's saying, this update broke my workflow, my control key is hard to reach, so when I hold my spacebar instead, it makes my computer heat up, and I've configured my computer to interpret that as control, and the fix is that the CPU no longer overheats when you use the spacebar. It's like, this has broken my workflow. So if your users are used to doing things in really weird and arcane ways, like developers, and they have a lot of they're very attached to their particular, incredibly broken ways of doing things, and you're about to change some of that things, when people have been relying on things that were not actually features, but simply quirks of your software, and you're going to change them, and you're going to deprecate the old existing version, and get rid of this workflow that's been working perfectly for someone, even though it's terrible, you might want to run a public beta and give people time to get ready for the new world, essentially. So we come back to this idea of the quality of the product. And public betas, essentially what they're for is, if you are here at the MVP stage of a new product, and letting people use your thing is going to help you get to here. If the metrics for quality that you need in order to know that you're here are ones that can only be acquired through letting people use it, then this is what you want. And not only knowing that you're there, but helping you get there. So, when should you start a public beta? There are lots of opinions on this. Here is mine. I think that it's not just that when you get to the MVP stage. You have to be here at least. This is the minimum that you need in order to make a feature available to users. But it has to also let them solve new problems. This goes back to the idea that it has to be worthwhile for your users to partake in a public beta. So if I'm giving my users something that kind of sucks, but it lets them solve a new problem that they've really been wanting to be able to solve for a while, they're more likely to put up with the kind of jankiness of the unfinished product. So whether or not you're introducing an entirely new feature, or you're replacing an existing feature with one that is better and has more functionality, lets them solve new problems in that existing space, I think this is also a prerequisite for starting public beta. Because at the end of the day, your software exists to help users solve problems. And as you improve your software, you should be letting them solve new problems or solve existing problems better. You don't want to annoy your users by offering them something that's wrong, right? And there are a couple of ways that you can get this wrong when you're deciding when to start a public beta. You could give them something that's unusably buggy, something that's not even at the MVP stage. You could release something that just sucks, doesn't let them solve new problems. They're like, why would I use this? What are you doing by releasing this as a public beta? But you can also annoy them by releasing something that's really polished and finished and of a sort of high standard of quality, but it's wrong. It doesn't let them solve the problems that they wanted to solve. It solves them in a way that they don't like. It introduces new kinds of workflows that they just dislike. So there are the sort of two modes of failure here: is you release something too early or you release it too late. So public betas are kind of tricky in that sense that it's a bit of a judgment call knowing your user base and how likely they are to tolerate either of these failure modes will let you adjust between the two of them, essentially. So you've decided to start your public beta. You know that what you're releasing is not unusably buggy. You want user opinions. It's going to help you get to the place that you need to be. You will need to document what's going on in your software. And this is hard. As I said, you're kind of documenting two versions of reality because you need to cater to the people who have not opted into your beta and the people who have. If you don't do any kind of documentation for your beta, people will not be able to use it. So, in the case of, I don't know, a banking app, thinking of non-developer tooling situations, you're going to need to have sort of like, how do I find the information I need to fill out this new form or use this new section of the app or something? This kind of documentation needs to exist, but it also needs to be clear that this is a beta and it's not actually yet the standard way of doing things for your piece of software. So the answer to this is it depends, which I'm sure you've heard a lot over the last couple of days. This is a software conference after all. This is a timeless classic answer. I'll tell you what it depends on. For new features, if you're going to document something, if you're going to release, we have a new observability platform. We didn't have one before, we have a new one. Obviously, all the documentation for that is going to be new. And so you just say, this is beta documentation, and you just publish it alongside the new product. But documentation is not easy, right? Just because it's simple does not mean it's easy. You still have to get it right. Documentation is its own whole conference, so I'm not really going to go into that too much. But the tricky thing about public betas is when you're replacing an existing function, a sort of existing part of your product, this gets really complicated because you have two conflicting views of reality. You don't have nothing and a new thing. You have the old thing and a new thing. And there might be quite different ways of interacting with your software depending on which one people are using, and you don't know which that is. So I have seen two ways of doing this, and I will tell you what they are. So bearing in mind that your docs they have responsibilities towards your product. Your docs have to be clear. They have to be correct, obviously, first, yeah, that you don't want to document incorrect things. They have to be clear so that people don't spend ages looking through your documentation to find the answers to a question. This is all kind of obvious stuff if you've written documentation before. And they have to be complete. You shouldn't be leaving things out of your documentation. But these last two become in conflict when you're documenting two versions of reality. Clarity and completeness, how do you do both at once? When, to be complete, you have two separate things that you're trying to do. So I think this is the easiest one. This is you document your beta in line with existing documentation that you have. So you have on the pink there is like, this is how the current standard way of doing things is. And then you have a little call out that says, if you're using the beta version, actually it works like this. If you're using the new thing, this is the way that you do it. And this one is really good when you're doing short-lived betas because it's got low overhead in terms of your documentation platform. It means that you only have to add in little bits here and there about what changes with your new beta product. But it does introduce noise in your documentation. If I'm an existing product user, if I'm not part of your beta, and I'm reading through this, I'm scrolling past all of these call-outs that have got nothing to do with what I'm doing, and I'm going to get a bit annoyed. So that's the drawback with this one. The other option that I also like, and I saw it done very, very well at Anvil, is that you have two sets of documentation side by side. And you have a little toggle that says, I'd like to be in the new world where I'm using the beta and I'm understanding how things are going to work, and I have all of the documentation that tells me how to do things in the beta version. And then you can uncheck a box, and suddenly you are back in the sort of established, existing world. And this gets rid of that problem of having noise. Suddenly, the only docs you see are the ones that are relevant to you. But it has high engineering overhead for how you actually maintain these docs and present them on your website, right? How do you implement that toggle? How do you do these things? At Anvil, what we ended up doing was we actually had 2 sets of documentation that were generated from the same templates, and behind the scenes, the actual markdown looked like this, and then it was like a little if statement that generated different docs based on what the toggle was doing on the user for each user. But I think this is worth it for long-term betas. Depending on how long-term you might be running something, maybe it's like a couple of years. Some people do betas for that long. I think the new IDE at Anvil ran for maybe a year and a half, that beta, and they did this. So you can see it here. This is some Anvil documentation, and at the top, you can see that's the toggle. And it worked pretty well. This was good, but it did take engineering work to do in a way that first option of just documenting things in line did not. So that's the trade-off there. So you've started public beta, you're documenting it well, you're ready to start collecting your users' feedback. So this is the entire point of the public beta, right, is to hear from your users about the thing that you're building, use those opinions and that feedback in order to make product decisions going forward. You've got to make it easy for people to do that. You're asking for your users' help, perhaps unpaid, right? Because you can offer gift cards and credits and stuff for your software or whatever to participate in public betas. But you're asking for people to give you their time and effort and opinions. You've got to make it easy for them as well as worthwhile, right? Any kind of friction that's introduced in this process is going to mean you get less user feedback, and your public beta is going to be less worthwhile for you. You should have at least one canonical place where people can send feedback and they know it will get heard. They know it will get put into a database somewhere. They know it will get at least seen, if not acted on, right? So you've got to allow unstructured feedback. It's very easy to think about, like, oh, did you like this bit? Rate this on a scale of 1 to 5. How easy did you find it to use this particular piece of new software? But you've got to let people tell you things in their own words, because that's how you get the really interesting insights. The failure mode of this is this. Got this form where it's like, yeah, if you provide people with this form, you're not going to get any useful insight. And obviously this is a joke, this is an extreme example, but this is the reason you allow unstructured feedback, so like emails, open text forms, maybe user interviews where you actually sit down with users over a Zoom call and talk about things, is so that you don't end up with missing out on potential feedback because you didn't think that it was something that somebody would say. Another really good thing is to interleave product points with products with feedback. So as people are using your thing, you can sort of have like, oh, was this helpful to you? Or, oh, this is the new beta feature. Click here to report a bug. Click here to send us an email about it. But this comes back to the thing about adding friction. If you're making it hard for people to use the beta because you're asking them for feedback constantly, this will end up being a drawback rather than a positive. So this one is one to sort of use with caution and be very smart about where you add friction into your user's journey. So conducting user interviews, I mentioned. This is really, really cool. This is a very high effort way of getting feedback from users. So it's like you find somebody who is a very heavy user of your beta. Depending on how well you know your user community, this might be easier or harder to identify these people. And you get in touch with them and you say, hey, we'll give you some credits on your account. We'll give you this, that, the other if you sit down with us for 45 minutes and give us your thoughts on the thing. What problems did it help you solve? If you could change anything about it, what would it be? Would you recommend this to somebody else? And if so, why? If not, why not? Things like this. And these are very open-ended methods of feedback where you get that kind of feedback that you had not anticipated. And I love doing these. I think these are so, so interesting to do. You've also got things like feedback forms, but don't make it like that one I just showed you. I like the open-ended ones. People don't tend to like filling these out, but they can be fairly low effort to try and, it's just click a link here. It's not as high effort for the users to do as an interview, but developers in particular hate filling these out. I know I never fill these out. User forums are a great source of feedback. If you have user forums, do not neglect them. A lot of the screenshots that I'm going to show you later of actual user feedback that I've seen in my time are from the forums at Anvil. I think maybe all of them are from the forums at Anvil. And finally, having a dedicated email address for people to send feedback to. These are all channels that you should be using, or you could be using, in order to get feedback from your users during a public beta. So once you've collected feedback, what should you do with it? Up to this point, this has all been kind of mechanical. Like you walk through these steps, you say, okay, I'm ready to start, I'm going to set up these channels. You know, it's all been fairly cookie cutter up to this point. Like it all kind of works the same depending on, like it doesn't depend highly on what your product does. This is the point at which it gets sort of, what your product specifically does is going to help you inform what to do with the user feedback. Because you might be looking for very specific things that are very obvious to pick out of what the people you've talked to are saying to you, or it might be more broad and vague. So depending on how big the public beta, the scope of the thing that you're releasing, you might be expecting to have very specific feedback, such as this button was hard to find, or oh, these logs were, like if in your observability platform, it's like, oh, these logs were presented in a really bad way. Or for something like an entire new IDE, you could be getting all kinds of incredibly varied feedback. What we've done in the past at Anvil was we sorted it into categories. And these are the 5 categories that I've used. Other ones may make sense depending on your context. This thing doesn't work at all. You'll get a surprising amount of that, actually. This thing doesn't work how it should. This thing doesn't work how I think it should. You get a lot of this with developers. And you get, can I have something else as well? This is great that you've released this new thing, but can I have this too? Or I'd rather have had something else. And these are the 5 categories that I think most feedback falls into. Unless it's someone who's just complaining massively about this. Oh, don't pretend you're too blind to see that there's massive glaring UX flaw here, blah, blah, blah. But useful feedback, I think, tends to fall into these categories. This doesn't work at all. You will get quite a lot of this, actually, in my experience. Maybe that says more about the public betas that I've been part of than anything else. But you'll get quite a lot of feedback saying, no, this straight up doesn't work. So here is a search on the Anvil forum for their latest public beta that they ran, and it's in the bug reports category, which means it has been actually moved by Anvil staff into that category. These are recognized bugs, not just people spamming it angrily, saying, oh, this isn't what I wanted. Yeah, this happens, and when this happens, you can't get defensive about it, especially as developers when we've built a thing and we're going, someone says, no, this straight up doesn't work. You go, what do you mean it doesn't work? I tested it myself, but it happens. This translates, obviously, directly into engineering work, right? This one is pretty simple. It sucks to hear, but you'll get it, and this is part of why you run a public beta, is to find things like this. You get the category of, this doesn't work how I think, this doesn't work how it should work. This means that, so here's one where it's like, this is weird. It's not broken, but it's weird, right? And this is from the public beta of the new IDE when they replaced the entire IDE. And it's just, hey, I want to do something that works in the old world, cannot possibly interpret this thing. Hey. And it's not that the thing is like, it straight up doesn't work, but it's doing something weird, right? This means that the user experience of your product is bad. It doesn't necessarily mean the thing doesn't work or that there aren't workarounds at all, but it does mean that there's something that needs to change because the users think that it's bad. Technically, this could mean that your product is still MVP quality, but this still translates directly into engineering work. Your users are saying, no, this actually is a bad user journey. This is a bad user experience. It needs to change. The next category is subtly different, and it kind of depends on, particularly if you have an existing relationship with a user, which Anvil had a very tightly knit, or still does have a very tightly knit developer community, where we would have some users where they gave us some feedback and we go, okay, we know that this is because you in particular are opinionated about this. And so differentiating this doesn't work how I think it should from the previous category can sometimes be a bit of an art form. What users are saying here, for example, here's one of our opinionated people from the Anvil forum, and he's telling us what he wants out of this thing. And he might not be wrong, right? But it's not, this is bad, it's here's my opinions about how it should be. And again, it's a very subtle distinction here, but it's about how much of the person's own bias is going into this feedback here. This means that the user experience might be bad. It might be a matter of opinion, depending on the developers that you talk to in the particular case of developer tooling. This is the really tricky one, because this is the one where you have to exercise some judgment about how you handle it. This is where you get this a lot from the ability to let people tell you things in their own words. If you've given them a very sort of limited feedback form, there might not be a place for this kind of feedback, but it's really useful. And this is something where it's really useful to be able to discuss with your users. So having a user forum where one of the engineers can hop on that thread and say, oh, okay, why do you want this? What would that solve for you? And you can actually have a conversation with the people about what it is that they really want out of your product and why they're giving you the feedback that they are. And it might translate into work, it might not. It depends what you end up deciding about this piece of feedback is that it either goes into, this doesn't work how it should, this person is right, or this person has a difference of opinion. I wanted something else instead. It's great that you've introduced this new observability platform, but what I really wanted was a way to deploy this specific Kubernetes implementation on your servers really easily, or something. In isolation, or why doesn't this include that function? It counts towards demand for the new feature. If you track demand anywhere in your organization of users said that they wanted this counts towards that, even though it's part of a completely different feedback loop. You can just acknowledge this for users. They say, oh, I wanted this, I wanted to have this. Why haven't you made this? You can say, cool, thank you for letting us know that would be really useful. You can justify your engineering decisions to your users at this point if you want to, but you don't have to. And it's very closely related to, can I have something else as well? A thing I learned at Anvil that was really interesting to me is that when you're doing your job well, particularly as an engineer or a product, somebody producing a product, is people don't say, this is great. They say, can I have more? And this is what that is. In isolation, this means it looks good to me. If someone's saying, oh, you've given me this new thing, but I want this, it means they don't have a problem with your new thing. And maybe it's kind of not very useful to you in your public beta that they don't have an opinion or whatever, but it means they're excited about what you're building and they want more of it. This counts again towards demand for that new feature, and all you need to do about this is acknowledge it and say, cool, thank you for letting us know that this is a thing that would be useful to you. Communicating back. So the last bullet point on each of those slides was about communicating back to your users. Does this translate into work? Tell them so. If somebody's giving you a piece of feedback you disagree with, you can discuss it with them. If somebody says, I want something, acknowledge it. Make them feel heard. You've got to communicate with your users throughout this process. You've got to communicate if you fix something. So yeah, here we go. This is in the feature requests section of the Anvil forum, and I searched for all the ones that have been done. So updating your users when you do something that they like, if you fix a bug that they've been complaining about, if you implement a feature that they've been wanting, let them know. It builds goodwill, it builds user trust, it makes them feel heard, it makes them more likely to give you feedback in future. So when you fix something, tell them about it. If you change something, tell them about it. This goes back to making sure that things are opt-in and well documented. So if you say, you know what, that wasn't actually a fix, but we've heard that you would prefer it this way, so we've changed it, we listened to you, we acted on it. Also communicating when you decide not to act on people's feedback. This might seem counterintuitive, because essentially what you're doing is you're saying to people, no, I disagree with you, I'm not going to make that change to my software because of what you said. But again, it goes back to making them feel heard, especially if you can give them some insight into why you've made the decision that you have, making people feel like a part of the process, which they are. It's not like making them feel like it. Showing them that they are a part of the process, making it clear that you actually considered their feedback instead of dismissing it out of hand and just ghosting them, essentially. This is one it can feel hard to do, but it's so, so worthwhile. So what you are aiming for is a situation in where you've updated your product and you're telling people about it. You've updated your product, you are collecting user feedback, and based on that user feedback, you're making decisions and you're communicating about them. And then you go right back to updating the product with those new decisions. And when this cycle is working well, this is what you're aiming for as part of the beta. And this is the sort of stable equilibrium of a public beta. And if you work in sort of an agile environment, this is just your normal, right? So that's what you're aiming for with a public beta. You're aiming to get to this stage. But things can and probably will go wrong. And I think that that cycle is a good way of looking at the categories of things that can go wrong. So things can go wrong when you update your product. You can ship something that's actually just straight up broken, and you'll get a load of those messages saying, this just doesn't work. And you don't want to do this because it's going to lose user goodwill for you. You've wasted their time. You've made them interact with something that's frustrating and does not work. You can let bugs go unfixed and unacknowledged. So when you don't ship things, this is a problem. And you can ship breaking changes without communicating about them well in advance. And again, this is very similar to shipping something that's broken. You're breaking users' workflows. You're breaking things for them. You can also have things go wrong at the point of users giving feedback. And the failure mode here is that they don't give you feedback at all. And reasons I've found for this are that they don't know how to do it. If you haven't broadcasted those feedback channels, like, hey, you can email us here, you can sign up to give us an in-person or over Zoom interview, oh, you can post on our user forums and get advice. If people don't know how to do those things, if you haven't signposted them well enough, they won't do them. If they can't express their views properly, if all they've got is a feedback form that says, do you like it? Yes, no, I love it, you know? If people haven't got the space to actually give you the feedback that they want to give, they won't give it to you because they can't. And the worst one is the last one. Oh, yeah, if you don't give them the space, then that's that form. The last one is the worst one. If people don't think that they'll be heard, and this is really hard to fix. You know, the first two, if people don't know how, okay, you can communicate better about the ways they can get in touch with you. People can't express their views properly, you add an open text field to at the end of your feedback form, whatever. But users not thinking they'll be heard is really, really hard to fix, because the problem there is that they don't trust you, and they don't think that you're going to take their views on board, and so they don't even bother trying to talk to you, even if they know how to do it, even if they have a way to say what they want to say. They feel like they'd be shouting into the void. And this is why public betas really run on user trust and user goodwill. And having a community of users that are willing to opt into a public beta is a result of having user trust and goodwill. If you don't have that, it's kind of a non-starter. So the next way that things can go wrong is when you are making the decisions based on that user feedback, and the failure mode of communicating about those decisions that you're making. If you fail to communicate about what you're going to do, users will fear like sneaky updates to your products. So the reason I call it sneaky is because of this thread on the Anvil forum. And yeah, Rick is saying, you know, user feedback's really useful. Anvil don't publicize how well when they change things. This means they lose out on user feedback. We should start a thread to celebrate and note the things that Anvil does in its development, because Anvil does a sort of very continuous development, has a very continuous development sort of mode. That's how it operates. And you can see that there are 148 posts in this thread that was started a couple of years ago. Actually, since I took this screenshot, there's a bunch more as well. And this thread is, while it's lovely, people are noticing things that have changed about the platform that they like, it also represents a failure of the platform team to communicate about the things they're changing. Because people made this thread because they were like, people need to know about these changes, and that communication isn't coming from the team. So users can be afraid of relying on things because they don't know if you're going to change them under their feet. You lose that chance for feedback, exactly as Rick on the Anvil forum said. This is a wasted opportunity to get people's opinions while you're running a public beta. And users lose trust, which is, again, crucial, absolutely crucial when you're running a public beta. So if you manage to avoid all those pitfalls, if you run into them, you'll hopefully be able to diagnose and address them. This whole cycle will be working well. And as you progress through this cycle over and over again, you get closer to your aim for quality. So as we get closer and closer to that, you might start thinking, okay, this product is getting ready to become like generally available. I don't think this needs to be in beta anymore. How do you move towards wrapping it up? When do you know? How do you know when it's time for your public beta to be over? Well, when everyone in the world is happy and the children are singing and your software has solved all the world's problems, right? That's never going to happen. That quality line never actually reaches perfection, right? But you should be aiming when you've got to this part of the curve, right? What were you aiming for with this public beta? We come back to our proxies for quality when we think about measuring this, when measuring that success. Whatever you use, and these are only examples, whatever you use as a proxy for quality in your software development paradigm, come back to those and see, have we got there yet? Is it on par with what people already think about our existing product? Do people, sometimes at Anvil, what we got people saying, actually, I don't think you need to be doing this beta anymore. I'd like you to make this GA so you can focus on new developments, which is really interesting and something I think you'll probably not find in, you'd probably only find that with developer tooling. But that was really interesting. So you come back to your proxies for quality and you say, are we there yet? Are we at this point yet? If you've got feature parity with your existing product, if you're doing a new product that replaces an existing one, you need at least feature parity, right? So the new IDE at Anvil needed to be able to do everything that the old one could because we didn't want to take functionality away from users. Like the feedback that we got at Anvil, people say, hey, please unblock your future development by moving this out of beta. This one is one to handle with caution because as engineers, we like building things. We get excited by a new thing. If something's been in beta for a while, we're like, oh, I just want to get this done and over with so I can move on to the next greenfield thing that I want to work on. So this one is one to handle with caution because our bias as people who want to build things and get started on shiny new projects might lead us to put too much weight on this particular metric for knowing if we should be done with things. But it is a thing. You don't want to have something you don't want to stay in that situation where you've got two versions of reality for so long that you can't build on top of either of them, right? And you also always have to remember that when you're going to be ending a public beta, you've got to communicate that to your users. You give them, especially if it's the situation where your users have a lot of inertia and you give them time to get used to the new world, you say, okay, this thing is going to be the standard way of doing things in a month's time, 2 months' time, and we're going to be deprecating the old one. You've got to communicate with your users through each step of the public beta, including when you plan to wrap it up. So, we have talked about what a public beta is, when to use one, how do you document it, how do you collect feedback, how do you use feedback, and how do you wrap it up at the end? When and why, documentation, user feedback, and wrapping it up. But the one thing that I really hope you take away from this, and is applicable to people, whether or not it's developer tooling or other things, is that you have to treat your users with respect, because you need them more than they need you. Thank you very much for your time. That QR code takes you to a little link where you can give me feedback, because this is itself a public beta. Right, thank you very much. Oh, my mic's gone. Do we have any questions, by the way? We've got time, but I won't stop you going to grab coffee if you want to go grab coffee.
And I guess what I was going to do initially is just pay forward to all these open source contributors. So I'm giving away free licenses, not selling it yet. So I guess it really is a public beta. And I think I do have a feedback form within the app where they can do that. And I think you've convinced me that I should probably allow them to put their email addresses in there. Although, as a single developer, I sort of fear being flooded.
Yeah, I mean, so the question about having a sort of in-product feedback form, but also allowing perhaps an email address where people can give more unstructured feedback, and not wanting to get flooded with responses to that open channel. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. What sort of friction could you add to? So if you don't want people to be like, I guess, spamming you at that email address, or what you want to do is sort of perhaps make it so that only the people who really, really want to give you that feedback, whose feedback will be most useful through that channel, are going to be bothered to do it. So like add friction into the process of getting the email. Like maybe at the bottom of your feedback form, you can say, oh, okay, well, because the thing is that any way of getting in touch with you is subject to potentially to spam, right? What is the kind of feedback that you think you would get through an email that you wouldn't through your feedback form?
No, it's just if it's a one-way thing where they're giving me feedback, so I'm going to track it in UTrack.
So enabling you to have discussions with people.
Right, because then my overhead goes way up.
Yeah, okay. Asking people to leave their contact details on the feedback form so that you could get back to them and be the one to initiate that discussion after them, maybe? I don't know. That might be an option for you. If what you're looking for is a dialogue that comes out of the user feedback that you get, giving them the option to leave their contact details, and then you can initiate it, and then you're also in control of how much of that you take on.
My other question was, too, that I understand with UTrack, so basically what will happen is they'll submit it, it'll get up to UTrack, it's initially marked private. Is it a good idea to make most of that public-facing as well?
Oh, like an issue tracker for your... At Anvil, they haven't. So what Anvil had public, and this is kind of my template for it and where a lot of my opinions come from, they had a feature request bit on the forum where people could submit what they wanted to happen. And that, I think, would be something akin to like opening an issue on GitHub where you say, I'd really like this thing. And that was public. Anybody could make a feature request. We did throttle that so that you couldn't spam that with feature requests, because that did happen a few times. Again, if you do your job well, people want you to do more of it, right? And that way, it's public because it allows users to see if the thing they want is something that other people want, and they can have discussions about what they want it to look like, which is obviously really useful to the product team. So that kind of thing, I think having it public has real value. Issue trackers like bugs, I think, is a little bit more risky because those are the things that people get angry about. And so I think what the best way, I think, to handle that kind of thing is public acknowledgement that you know about the bug and that it's on your radar and it's in your internal issue tracker, but not giving any more visibility than that into that process. Because that way the users will feel heard, and they, and then it's kind of like, okay, your engagement, your involvement in the process of this bug getting fixed has now ended because you have successfully reported it, and now it's the ball is in your court as the developer. But I think giving them visibility into exactly where that issue is at in sort of a more internal sense, like a sort of, oh, here's the commits that I've made in order to fix this bug, is probably not worthwhile. That would, again, my personal opinion, so.
Super, thank you.
Any more for any more? A lot of people are staying here for the next talk? Next talk in room 1, or?